Dan Dolan, who is a deputy director at Reprieve. He coordinates advocacy activity across the organization. Reprieve fights for victims of extreme human rights abuses, with a focus on the death penalty and indefinite detention without trial. Reprieve are spearheading the campaign to pressure the UK government to seek the immediate release and return of Jagtar Singh Johal to his family in Scotland. The Sikh lobby was held to coincide with his 34th birthday. Support #FreeJuggy now.
Ever so much, Preet, and thank you everyone for attending today. It's a good opportunity, as you say, on Jaggy's birthday, to assess 3.5 years on from his initial detention, just how important it is to try and get him home. And I want to just explain why Reprieve has joined the campaign recently on Jaggy's case, joining the fantastic work that Redress and many others have been doing, including the APVG. And the very alarming news that many of you will have seen in the media in recent weeks is that Jaggy is now facing a possible death sentence. And that clearly is a deeply chilling development based on what we know about the case. The fact that a death sentence could be hanging over this young man's head. Jaggy's facing the death penalty on a host of charges. In January, and my colleague Darsha, who's here today, will talk a bit more about this, he was remanded to the notorious special cell in Delhi on a fanciful charge which relates to a criminal act carried out years after Jaggy was first detained. He was in prison when it took place, in fact, in a COVID lockdown. So the idea he could have been involved is really fantasy. But in addition to this additional spurious charge, Jaggy also faces the death penalty based on 3 other charges, which date back to his original detention in 2017. And I just want to remind everybody on this call, although I know that you will be very familiar with the facts of the case, Jaggy's original detention and the horrific interrogation that followed that involved days of brutal torture. Electrocution, the threats that he would be burned alive. The torture was so severe he had to be carried out of his interrogation room. And after that, he was forced to sign blank sheets of paper, and those signatures are the sole basis for the case against him. So Jaggy is facing the death penalty off the back of that brutal torture confession. And I think it's really important when we consider how chilling and how severe it is that the death penalty may be levied against him, that the case that's based on is so thin and is so premised on those original acts of brutal torture. And I think that's really crucial. We believe at Reprieve that the fact Jagtar is facing the death penalty should be a long overdue wake-up call for the British government. And it should prompt a call at last for Jaggy's release and for Jaggy to be brought home to his family in the UK. And I know Gurpreet is on the line today. Jagtar, I cannot say this any more clearly, Jagtar is arbitrarily detained. And it is UK policy to call for the release, to seek the release of British nationals where they meet that designation when they're arbitrarily detained. The Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab has made that very clear. He told the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament that where a British national is arbitrarily detained, the UK government will seek their release. And that could be extremely consequential in this case. So if the UK government were to stand up and seek Jagtar's release, we think it could make a serious difference in getting him home. And at Reprieve, we worked on the cases of many arbitrarily detained British nationals facing the death penalty around the world. And in cases where there is arbitrary detention, the UK government has stood up, sought release, and it has worked. And people have been brought home after that kind of action. So today, I would say the silence is deafening when it comes to seeking Jagtar's release. So Reprieve and Redress's legal analysis is that Jagtar meets the international criteria for being arbitrarily detained very clearly. And that is based on a number of categories set out by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. And those include that Jagtar's detention is a breach of his due process rights on the basis of the brutal torture confession on which his case is premised. And also that there is no lawful basis for his detention for a host of reasons, including his initial unlawful arrest and the very prolonged period in which he has sat in pre-trial detention on a case premised on a torture confession. So it's very clear here that the arbitrary detention threshold is met. There's very little doubt about that. And it's also very clear in black and white that the FCDO's policy is to seek the release of UK nationals in that position. So why haven't we heard that? I think it's really important right now for us to be asking the government, what is your determination as to whether Jagtar is arbitrarily detained? And why hasn't the British government, 3.5 years on, sought his release? And how and why hasn't the FCDO made a new assessment based on the fact this young man is now facing a death sentence after all of the appalling things that he's been through? Why hasn't there been a new assessment of that? And I would say that we have received correspondence today from the FCDO that notably fails to make a determination on Jagtar's arbitrary detention, but suggests that the FCDO would like to see analysis from Reprieve as to whether Jagtar is arbitrarily detained. Now, I would say we have already sent that analysis, but also, I mean, I'm somewhat taken aback that after 3.5 years, the FCDO may be relying on an NGO to make an assessment which is critical to its own policy in whether to seek the release of British nationals. So I would urge everybody on this call to strongly call for the FCDO to seek Jagtar's release on this basis, on the basis of the FCDO's own policy, and also ask why hasn't there been a determination made as to whether Jagtar is arbitrarily detained. And as a final point on that, I would just flag that wonderfully many people on this call and members of the group have signed a joint letter which is currently being coordinated, which is calling for Jagtar's release and is going to Dominic Raab, asking the FCDO to take action. And I would just encourage everybody on this call, please, if you are willing, do get in contact with us and with Jazz, and we can arrange to add signatures to that joint letter, because we want to send as powerful a signal as possible to the FCDO on this issue. And Preet, I'm wondering on that if I might hand over to my colleague Darsha Jagatheswaran, who is our regional lead for South Asia, who may be in a position to update this group on some of the wider developments that have happened in Jagtar's case, just for a couple of minutes, because there have been significant developments, as you'll know, over the last couple of weeks.